I want to welcome everyone to the Alden Kindred's presentation of the Society of Jesus and Jesuit Rings in New England and its borderlands. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the Executive Director. The Alden Kindred preserves and shares the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden at their homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts, through guided tours, educational programs, exhibitions, publications, and genealogical research. I'd like to offer a special welcome to our members who are joining us today, whose support helps make programs like this possible. If you'd like to learn more about the Alden House Historic Site or contribute to its mission, please visit alden.org. And now I'd like to introduce Christopher Lee. Christopher has served as a genealogist for the Alden Kindred since 2019 and currently works as Executive Director of the Loyola Jesuit Center in Morristown, New Jersey. Christopher will give a short introduction about the program and then introduce our presenters. Welcome, Christopher.
Thanks so much, Desiree. So I am coming to you from a Jesuit center and speaking to you as a member of the Alden board. So this was a neat crossover in two areas where I have a good familiarity. We're very blessed to be joined by two gifted presenters today. Often we'll have genealogists or historians. Today we have two archaeologists joining us. Dr. Laura Masur is coming to us from Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., where she's an assistant professor specializing in historical archaeology in the Mid-Atlantic. Her research focus currently is on the Jesuit system of plantations and missions. Some of this has been in the news recently, or in recent years, and it's a very exciting area. So since 2014, she has studied the system of the plantations in early America, particularly in the Jesuits' Maryland province, which is now part of the Jesuits' USA East province, where the organization that I run is its Center for Apostolic Spirituality, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, spiritual direction, and a lot of the things that the early Jesuits were engaged in their missionary work on the continent. Dr. Masur's process has involved research in archives, archaeological collections, and on mission sites. And she has a number of ongoing fieldwork pieces in some of the former plantation sites. Would you suggest to the group where some of those plantation sites are that they may be near?
So if you are in Maryland, you have one close to you, unless you're really far west in Maryland. So there's a lot in St. Mary's County, all the way up into the Eastern Shore. There's a few in Pennsylvania, Eastern and Central Pennsylvania. I'll have a map later, so you can identify which one's closest to you.
And so you are an archaeologist, you're also an anthropologist, and you're developing some exciting new scholarship. Before I jump to our other presenter, we're seeing a lot of scholarship come out on the first Jesuits, on the period of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation in Europe. This area of the North American and the American encounters between Jesuits and Native people is also a really significant area of emerging scholarship. And so what Dr. Masur and Dr. Beaupre, who I will introduce in just a moment, are working on is really kind of the cutting edge of scholarship right now. Dr. Andrew Beaupre, you are the curator of archaeological collections at the Maine State Museum. Your focus has been the French colonial world, where, of course, the Jesuits were a significant contributing set of personalities. You are the grandson of French-Canadian immigrants, which to those of us involved in genealogical circles is an exciting reason to get into the scholarship and the study of a particular part of our history. Some of the areas of focus then for you have been excavations both in the US and Canada, work on the Jesuit relation, the French Jesuit material culture, historical archaeology in military installations, which I think is exciting because you just moved to Maine, I only recently came to New Jersey from Massachusetts and had a lot of crossover in the area of military archaeology in my years in New England. And the border politics, which I think you kind of take a broad view. We spoke a little bit about some of the current border politics, but also the border between Puritan New England and the English colonies and the French was also a very significant border in the colonial world. Welcome to both of you, Dr. Laura Mosur, Dr. Andrew Beaupre. We're very glad to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me make sure. Is my screen shared okay? Can you see the slides? Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
looks good.
wonderful. I want to double check before we get too far. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. We're both really excited to be here today. And so what we're going to be doing today is tag teaming a little bit. We'll go back and forth. I'm generally going to be covering more of the English Jesuit side of the history and the archaeology, whereas Dr. Beaupre will cover the French Jesuit side of things. And you get a very different history because of the politics. And as a result, the archaeology ends up looking very different as well. And we'll close. Dr. Beaupre put together some really great hypotheses on how the ring came to be at the Alden House. So you all have that to look forward to at the end of the presentation. So as we get started, what we're talking about here, we're talking about the Jesuits. So this is a Roman Catholic religious order. So there are many different Catholic religious orders. And this one is one of the later formed ones. It's formed in the wake of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. It's formed by Ignatius of Loyola and 5 of his friends. They're mostly Spanish. They're living during the 1500s, and they are impassioned. They take vows together in 1534, and then their organization they call the Company of Jesus, the Society of Jesus, is officially founded within the Catholic Church and recognized in 1540. And they, from that point on, go out and form missions throughout the world. We tend to think of missions formed by religious orders as something that's, oh, you have a mission to maybe indigenous people, American Indians, but it's actually a really broad idea, this idea of mission, particularly for the Jesuits. And they are officially founded, they take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and this is pretty common among Catholic religious orders. But they also have a vow of mission that's to the Pope. So they're going to go out on mission. They're going to spread Christianity. They're going to spread Catholicism throughout the world. So when we look at the history of the Jesuits, we think of them today as perhaps best known for educational institutions, being learned people. But this is only sort of one part of their mission, but they certainly use it. When we look at where they have missions, it's more a question of where do they not have missions, right? So there are Jesuits who go, Italian, French, Spanish Jesuits who go across the world. You can see Matteo Ricci here in China, who's basically working in the world of the Enlightenment and trying to use knowledge of science and knowledge of sort of the learned world as a tool of conversion. Places like China, where you have a lot of really well-educated people. They go to India, they go throughout Africa, West Africa, and there are also missions throughout Europe as well. So you see Jesuits like Richard Blount, who's going into England to form a mission to try and reconvert Protestants. So the context of what I look at when I'm studying English Jesuits is the context of that English mission, where they're having to sort of set up camp in Europe, in some of the Catholic countries, and then send missionaries back into England. And so the mission that happens in Maryland is an outgrowth of that. So I'm going to transition it to Dr. Beaupre, who can talk to you a little bit about indigenous missions and then the mission specifically in New France.
Well, thank you, and I'm very happy to be here as well. So a little bit about the indigenous missions. So as Dr. Mazur was just saying, the notion that at points these Jesuits are going into their own cultures or into cultures that they're familiar with. In the case of the English, there's a kind of I don't want to say an easier transition, but obviously there's a religious line that they're making the transition of. When the Jesuits take on indigenous missions, it's a very much of a different project, right? And so much like she's talking about with India and China, the Jesuits had to adapt to the environment with which they were in and come to a cultural understanding. And that's why we as archaeologists and anthropologists in the current day have a benefit of using the work that the Jesuits actually created in the past to understand a culture. And their goal was to try and enter a culture, in this case, indigenous missions, to learn the indigenous language, to understand not just the language, but a set of cultural means, right? Where people are meeting and where they can understand each other, to then take the next step in trying to convert those people to Christianity. And so that was done a number of different ways. And what's great as an archaeologist is to look at the sites of those missions, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. But you have the Jesuits now traveling from France and the Jesuit colleges and getting training. They're actually very heavily trained in what it's like to go to these areas. And then they settle in the Séminaire du Québec. They come and they have an enclave in Quebec City, the capital of New France, where they're coming, and then having an opportunity to adapt to the culture and the environment that they're in now in cold Canada, and then spread out to the missions. And so they would go far flung. And I actually have 19th century sketch of what that looks like, proselytizing to the native people. But also there's a film that's based on a novel called Brian Moore, and the author's Brian Moore, called Black Robe. Black Robe is the shorthand used by the native people to describe the Jesuits, right? And actually other missionaries as well, but we just kind of take it with the Jesuits as the only one. But so that discussion of this novel and then the film, it's in American cinematic history, plays on the ride of that Last of the Mohicans kind of nouveau Western thing that happened in the 1990s. But fascinating film, and the mission the same way that looks at a mission to the indigenous Spanish Jesuit mission. But Black Robe is great, the novel and the film, if anyone's interested, to take a look at that process by a gentleman from France making that transition to native culture. And a lot of the actual themes that are there are taken from the Jesuit Relations, these great documents that have been left behind, to understand how the Jesuits are trying to interact and learn a culture and see things like, they've honestly never seen before, the version of profanity that's being spun by the native people constantly. They're very open sexuality, other things that they discuss in this kind of a view of what it's like for someone from an outside culture. Can you hit one more slide for me, Laura? Thank you. Another great leftover from Jesuit interaction in indigenous missions is this. The Huron Carol. Father Jean de Brébeuf is a Jesuit out to the Sainte Marie among the Huron, in what's now Midland, Ontario. And he takes the story of the Christmas Carol and he converts it not only into the Huron language, but then into a Huron version of understanding, and tries to explain the nativity at the level that a Huron would be able to culturally ascribe to it. It's been made into a number of children's books. It's really neat to look at. And there's a song as well, a number of different recordings to kind of see that little cultural leftover that we can see now of what it was like for those indigenous missions to happen. Next slide, please. So talking about the missions in New France, I kind of split them into three categories I want to talk about quickly. Here is this vision of what New France and the rest of North America looked like in 1645. Next slide, please. That first group of missions are going to be those enclave missions, where the Jesuits go out and set up their own mission villages to the native people. In this case, the church owns this reconstruction of Sainte Marie among the Huron in Midland, Ontario. Fascinating site to visit. reconstructed based on archaeology, but a style of Jesuit mission where they took a group of missionaries and they dropped them out to the end of the earth, really, hundreds of miles from Quebec City and what they were accustomed to, and created their own medieval town, essentially. Almost a monastery setup. It's gated. It has 3 different sections where an interior where only the brothers and fathers were allowed, and then a middle section where they believe the neophytes were allowed to interact with the brothers and fathers, and then a farthest out walled section that was only for native people who had not yet converted. And so they had this kind of separation of space, which is something we look at fascinating as archaeologists. But Jesuit missions to one particular area, in that case, next slide. Then you have moving inland, you have this Jesuit mission idea to an established French military post or town. And so instead of going to the natives, in this case, it was a military post at St. Frederick, and the parish was established there in 1731. This fort you're seeing here is actually built in 1733 and occupied as a parish until the British got there in 1759 and sent my relatives packing back north. But the notion that there were Jesuits that were ministering not only to native people in these missions, but also to their communities as well, to French settlers. And then the final kind of mission that we talk about are these itinerant missions, or the Norwich Walk mission is a great example of that, where instead of an enclave that was built by the Jesuits in a native community, it would be a single solitary individual that would travel to a number of native communities. In this case, this is an image, a 19th century image of the death of Father Ryle in 1724 at the Norwich Walk mission when the British burned them out. And Father Ryle also had an interesting political mission. It was not just an association to native people. All of the Abenakis, and he says very openly in his documents at the time, had been converted to Catholicism, but he was there as an agent of the French government as well as an agent of religion to make sure that the native people in the area stayed happy-go-lucky with the French, and we're going to keep that control through religion and through actually economic exchange as well. And I'll turn it back over to Dr. Mazur.
So it's really fascinating hearing this history of the French missions, right? Because when you look at the English missions, you pretty much need to get rid of all of those notions about how a mission works, right? Because when you're operating in a colony where religion is a point of contention and a very political point of contention, it's not so much just about like, oh, let's make sure Indigenous people remain trading partners with the English. It's the English, the Protestant English fighting the Catholic English for control over trade, control over, of politics, essentially, of the colony. So when we look at the Maryland colony, Maryland is founded in 1634. The social elites in Maryland are Catholic, right? The governor, the founder, the proprietor are all Catholic. As are most of the wealthy people, but the vast majority of the people living in Maryland are all Protestant, and this creates some political challenges, right? And so when we place the Jesuits in this context, they're not even just getting along with all of the Catholics, right? Because there's a tenuous piece that the proprietor is trying to keep and the governor is trying to keep. These are the Calvert family. What ends up happening, the Jesuits come and they're filled with zeal is perhaps the way it would have been phrased. They really want to go to Maryland, and there are a couple different motivations for that. Father John Cooper, I think he's very modest. He's like, I'm not that smart. I'm not going to do really well at a university in Europe, but send me to Maryland because I can convert barbarians, right? Barbarian is the term used for Indigenous people from English at this point. And so you see that as a motivation, right? There's the sense that we're going to convert Native people the same way that the French Jesuits want to. Another sort of question is how you're going to handle going into a colony where the majority of Europeans are Protestant. Now, the Jesuits, whenever they go in anywhere, they're like, well, we're going to convert everybody, right? But this Father Francis Parker is looking at it and saying, It might be a little hard for me to handle the heretics, right? And this is the term he's using to refer to the Protestants. You know, there are these terms today that sound really charged, but they're the typical terms that are used in historical documents. So what ends up happening in Maryland, again, we see another image of, you know, the founding of Maryland. All of these really iconic images come from the 19th century. Really form the sort of the romance of thinking about the past when the reality was pretty tough. In Maryland, there's a mission founded to the Piscataway shortly after the original settlement. The Piscataway Paramount Chief Kinamaquand and his family decide to convert after a few years. And this is a political choice as much as a religious one, that has to do with, I think, reflecting on the violence of English settlement in Virginia. This is no secret to the Piscataway, who are very similar culturally to indigenous groups in Virginia. And they're like, well, maybe if we sort of play their game, things will go better for us politically. It doesn't. Right? Because the politics are real tough. What ends up happening is there's a mission to indigenous groups in Maryland, but there's also, you know, just an ongoing mission. There's a short mission that's founded in Virginia. Not sure where. There's not a whole lot written about it because they don't want their letters intercepted. So the French Jesuits write all kinds of letters. They have the Jesuit relations that Dr. Beaupre mentioned. In Maryland, they don't write a whole lot down. They send a few letters back to England and Rome, but they don't write a whole lot down. We do know that they are working with indigenous groups because, you know, you have essentially figures like Jasper Dankarts, who's living on the eastern shore of Maryland. And he's like, I really don't like those Jesuits. They keep, you know, ingratiating themselves with Native communities. We have a Catholic governor of New York, Governor Donkin, who invites the Jesuits to the English Jesuits. He sees what the French are doing with the Jesuits, and they're like, maybe if we invite English Jesuits to come, we can use them to, you know, essentially take part in the fur trade, right? And set up those relationships. It doesn't last real long. A lot of this is curtailed after the Glorious Revolution when William and Mary ascend the throne in England. But we do see some holdover, that there continue to be these kinds of missionary relationships, even into Pennsylvania. There's a German Jesuit who has a farm, and there are indigenous people living in that farm right around the time of the French and Indian War, and that's probably why it gets written down. When these references to missions really are only written down when someone's like, I don't like what those Jesuits are doing, right? So you see a very, very different context. You don't have this formalized system of missions the same way that you do in French Canada. What you do see are a system of plantations. So if you think about the way that, you know, these home missions or these mission systems will be set up in French Canada, it's something a little different. It's a plantation in Maryland. It's a plantation where originally indentured servants are farming tobacco, and then ultimately enslaved Africans are farming tobacco and other crops. So you can see one image of what one of these plantations looks like. This is an early 19th century watercolor of Conewago in Adams County, Pennsylvania. So that's right here on the map. But you can see this is it's a very different political context. So now we can get to the fun stuff, and talk a little bit about the archaeology, how you know, we as archaeologists look at the sites, but also the particular finds that can be indicative of missions. I want to give a little disclaimer here because we are talking about indigenous sites. Archaeologists have a really long and storied history of digging Native American burials, and this is something that we know today to be unethical. But it took archaeologists a long way to get there, and it's still not a complete point of clarity, right? That all archaeologists agree. One thing I will tell you is when you're looking at objects like Jesuit rings, a lot of them end up in Native American burials. And so a lot of the ones that archaeologists have excavated come from those burials. There's a law that's passed in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, that sets a procedure for returning human remains and grave goods back to Native communities. But, you know, there's also working in the spirit of the law. And so we're not going to be showing you any images that are from Native American burials. And I will tell you, in my experience, the vast majority of the rings that I've encountered are from those contexts. So we're going to be talking about the ones that don't come from those contexts, but it also acknowledging that. So we wanted to make that as a disclaimer. So Jesuit rings are only one kind of sort of Catholic objects that can be indicators of missions, or indicators of religious practice. So rosaries, rosary beads are pretty rare on sites, but you do find them. It's especially rare to see them connected like this, with metal connectors. They're often made of organic materials like wood or bone, but you also see them made of certain types of stone, or of glass, especially like black ones like this. You'll see crucifixes, you'll see medals, and medals are used particularly commonly on missions. You might see Jesuit rings, and I'm going to leave the more detailed discussion of those to Dr. Beaupre. You might see objects that are used in penance. These are two different silices. They're used for inflicting discomfort as a form of penance. So you see those both in New France and in Maryland. So this one's from Maryland, this one's from New France. And then you'll see objects that are a little bit more domestic in nature. This is a Madonna and Child. It's a very small figurine, maybe about 4 or 5 inches high, that was actually discovered on the plantation of a Huguenot in Maryland, which is it's a puzzling thing, right? You're like, well, it's a big political moment. You're going to leave, right? Leave the church, and you're going to leave France, right? To get away from it, but you still have this statue, right? That's something that grips me. And then finally, you have objects that are most closely related to saints' relics, and also the practice of the Eucharist. And so you have altar stones. These are objects that are placed on an altar, so and required for a priest to say a mass. And they contain first-class relics of saints within them, so part of a saint's body. You'll also see reliquaries. These have been found in Virginia and Maryland. This one's the coolest one, absolutely the coolest one, is from Jamestown. It was placed on top of Gabriel Archer's coffin. Very cool stuff. And I'm going to leave talking about the Eucharistic vessels to Dr. Beaupre. I saw that on one of your next slides, so we can talk about it then in a minute. And then finally, you'll see evidence of Jesuit saints and symbols. Particular Jesuit saints, like literally their faces appear on these religious medals: Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, Aloysius Gonzaga, Charles Borromeo. These are figures associated with the Counter-Reformation, figures associated with the Jesuits in particular. And so you see them depicted on medals, but you might also see other symbols, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph as common figures depicted. The Eucharist, you can see this right down here. You can see that the chalice and the Eucharistic host appear on a medal. And then you'll also see the Sacred Heart of Jesus, or sometimes other depictions of hearts. This is a woman who was enslaved by the Jesuits in Maryland. This really remarkable photo. You can see this, what looks like a piece of paper pinned to her. And this is probably a devotion that relates to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. That's particularly known for the Jesuits. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Beaupre, who can give you a little bit more detail on how some of these objects are used and unfolded at missions.
Sure, thank you again. So this, jumping this transition from the material culture to documentary record, for those of you who are kind of unaware, and as Dr. Mazur was mentioning earlier in an introduction, the idea that we as historical archaeologists, we have to be trained historians at the same time that we're trained archaeologists, right? So we have to be able to unpack the historical documentation at the same time to see how it dovetails with the material record. And the goal is to have those two records fit together so that we can provide a more nuanced and complete explanation of the past that's unavailable to just archaeology or documentary history independent. And so it reminds me of a story from one of my undergraduate professors was not very complimentary of historical archaeology, and he considered what Dr. Mazur and I do to be cheating because we had access to documents. Now, I think she mentioned earlier that there's not as many Jesuit documents from Maryland. We're a little, well, very lucky, I guess, in the northern side of the world in New France to look at that. But, we can actually find specific documentary references to the material culture we find in archaeological sites. In this case, taken straight from the Jesuit Relations. If anybody has interest in this topic, the Jesuit Relations are 73 volumes of letters written back and forth between Jesuit missionaries, brothers, fathers, and sent back to Quebec and then consolidated and edited and sent to be published in France in almost like a travel journal, like pro money raising explanation. Very much there's a little twinge to it. You see some of these letters have been edited later on in the Relations. The actual edited volume we use now is called the Jesuit Relations and Allied Documents, put together by a guy named Thwaites in the late 19th, early 20th century. But anyway, some of those things have been added toward the end. But the early Jesuit Relations were these edited and published volumes that were all about raising money. And so you can see here a plea for, hey, I'm a Jesuit, I'm out here on the frontier, and I could get more conversions if I had more stuff. And an understanding that the Jesuits are working within an early trade exchange economy where all of a sudden the native people have an influx of material culture that is new and rare and different. And so there's a lot of interest and need in wanting items, and not just items of devotion fall into that, but the knives as well. And there's, recall for kettles and other objects that the native people wish to use in their everyday lives that the Jesuits are then using as aids in conversion. And so they'll attempt to teach bits of the catechism and things like that in an attempt to convert native people with just these objects of devotion and aids in conversion to be objects of devotion, but also just as almost like presents or gifts for that exchange. The next slide is similar and brings us right back to, thank you. Brings us right back to what Dr. Mazur was talking about a minute ago with the rosaries, right? And we can see and we can unpack as anthropologists as well why black as the rosary bead. And there's many different theories among pre-contact archaeologists about the symbolism that black beads or black items carried in native culture pre-contact with Europeans that then get carried over into this relationship. And so maybe native people are seeing the black beads as having some sort of native cosmological meaning as well. Maybe they're seeing it solely as the Catholic meaning, or more than likely there's some sort of combined meaning in the two, in the way that we can track the creation of combined religions like voodoo, right? That it takes aspects from Catholicism and from Native African religion and from Native American religions and pushes them together. So really interesting things that we can unpack using these objects of devotion that may have entered what we call the systemic record or everyday use by people, and then get discarded or buried and enter the archaeological record. And we kind of unpack those and figure those things out. So next slide, please. So we're getting further down the road. So the question of Jesuit rings, right? We're going to come back. We're going to talk about it a little bit. We're going to go away from it. We're going to come back. But the Jesuit rings, when are they associated with Jesuits? And so another great joke I heard from undergrad, which is an old joke, but you ask 10 archaeologists a question and you're going to get like 12 or 15 answers. And so there are three options, right? When are Jesuit rings associated with Jesuits? And there are three bodies of literature that say always, number one, something like 100% especially in the early 17th century occupation, there's some sort of religious association. That is, of course, when we can see the ring itself, not just the form, but if there's religious symbolism on the ring itself, right? Some archaeologists, especially the ones that take this Marxist, capitalistic view of archaeology, say absolutely never. Native people never saw them as objects of devotion. Maybe the Jesuits brought them over as conversion, but the Jesuits were attempting to buy souls with baubles, and therefore the native never really saw them as, anything more than just a purchased item, just like trading for a beaver pelt or anything else. Oftentimes, at the same time that Jesuits are attempting to teach native people using these objects, the Jesuits are trading for food at the same time. They're trading for other necessities. And so there could be some confusion of a trade exchange economy. So they may be associated with Jesuits, but never in that wholly religious way. And myself and a lot of archaeologists have kind of settled on the number 3 answer now of sometimes, because we have to really unpack the conversation that's happening, this historical understanding of what does the Jesuit think when they're passing the ring over? What does the native think then when they're receiving the ring, right? And it's not necessarily that same trapping or understanding. Some really interesting studies have been done at archaeological sites like Michilimackinac in Michigan, which is a big mission and trading site, where they can separate the different layers of archaeological remains and say, well, for some reason, in the early habitation of the area, in the 17th century, when they're really starting to settle and the Jesuit missions are at St. Ignace on the north side of the straits or at Mackinac Island, it seems that the rings are only associated with contexts that are directly associated to the priest, the chapel, the priest's house, things of that nature. And then by the 18th century, it seems that traders kind of got the idea that the native people liked these rings and we can mass produce the rings and have them enter the trade at a much easier way for commercial exchange when there's no real religious meaning behind them. And so the image here is actually from a later, there's a silversmith who reproduces these rings with the scratching that he was a part of an excavation team that we had in Michigan. And he produces them and sells them. Those are all direct copies of ones that were found at archaeological site at the site of Fort St. Joseph in Michigan. And the hand is actually that of my wife because I gave it to her as a friendship ring before I gave her an engagement ring. So she gets a little shout out here. But so that that notion that there's also a tie to it, that it's not just a religious meaning, but association with a European understanding of giving and receiving rings as a love gift or a gift of affection. Some really interesting thoughts about that too. So when we look at, next slide, please. When we look at the archaeology of Jesuit sites in New France and New England, it's a huge topic, right? The Jesuits are very busy spreading a lot of both the itinerant missions and the core missions that they're building these kind of little hive missions around. There are way too many to talk about here, but I wanted to give you just a couple examples to unpack the kind of the ways that these Jesuit sites have been looked at. This is just the real eastern part of New France that has the bottom of Boston being involved in too, and we're going to make that connection back to the Alden family in a bit. But I wanted to kind of break the mission excavations that have been done in New France into 3 groups. Next slide, please. And so the first of those, we're going to use the Eucharistic vessels that Dr. Mazur was talking about earlier as an indicator of, and that is archaeological sites draw a lot of interest, especially in the 19th century when they were associated with great men of history, right? There was an association of a place-based learning, really early idea of we want to control that place, and it's kind of a leftover of colonialism, right? A lot of archaeological sites that were known to be of importance would be that importance to the American colonizing, the idea of manifest destiny, right? And this, Eucharistic altar service set comes from the mission that I mentioned before, with the guy who was being murdered, Father Ryle, in 1724. That site was pretty heavily looted by individuals that recorded it in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So we end up with objects that are Jesuit related or Jesuit associated that end up, in this case, that set is in our museum collection here in our stacks behind me, but don't have the heavy duty archaeological knowledge from a scientific excavation. Archaeologists will tell you it's not about what you find, it's about what you find out. And it's about the actual record of all of the artifacts working together and the different layers and different little aspects that we can pull out that tell a clearer story than just the object. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes the objects, in this case, are really cool, right? But it's more about that information. And so while we are happy to collect and conserve and curate those items like we do here at the museum, they don't tell the same amount of information as that next category, which is Directing you to the left-hand side of the slide here, sites that are excavated by professional archaeologists, where we have an opportunity to collect all of the information and understand how the artifacts work together, right? It's not just about one item, but where is that item in association to something else? I use this example in my classes of a pencil, right? I can stand up in the front of a lecture hall and I'm teaching a college class, and I hold up a pencil and it tells me absolutely nothing about where I am. If I disassociate the pencil from being inside a lecture hall, it's meaningless. Okay, it's a writing implement, it's not a lot of deal, right? But when you put the pencil together with a whiteboard and expo markers and a projector and the seats all showing in one direction versus, looking in one way, we can unpack that archaeological site and therefore tell more information about it. So we really strive for that. And there's a large amount of missions that have been protected because, quite frankly, still associated with the Catholic Church, and those sites have been protected within Canada specifically, and those could be scientifically excavated when necessary. So that's group number 2. You got the finds first, the isolated finds and the looting. You got the scientific excavation. And then you got number 3, jumping on that idea of protection, that last image in the bottom. Sometimes there's an awful lot of Jesuit-related archaeology that has yet to be excavated. Quite frankly, either the sites are protected. In the case of, there is a mission site at the bottom of, you're absolutely right, whoever said that. It does show the Jesuit settlement at Mount Desert Island. You're absolutely right. The Saint Xavier mission, which existed just for a few months, and we haven't been able to locate it archaeologically. We have an idea, but it hasn't been absolutely identified as an archaeological site. We know where it is, near Jesuit Springs and Jesuit Field. Sometimes maps help you, but we don't know exactly where that site is. So those sites are either protected, in that case, have yet to be found and may never be found, or they're under the protection of the church, like Isle Lamont. There's a shrine where there was a mission. Actually, it was Capuchin mission. It wasn't a Jesuit mission, but in Vermont there was a French mission that was there that has never been fully excavated. Some early excavations, but never fully uncovered because it remains inside a Catholic shrine site currently. So they're the sites that have been looted and pretty much destroyed, the sites that we've had some excavation of, and the ones that we're still looking for. And there's some great studies that have been done to look at a number of these archaeological sites that are available. I'm happy to give you resources too if you're interested. So back to you, Dr. Mazur.
Okay, so you've heard about some of these sites in New England, just because, New England, New France, northern New England. When we're looking at missions in Maryland, again, because the history looks different and the politics are different, the archaeological sites are wildly different, right? So when we look at, I'm going to call it sort of Greater Maryland, these plantations really form the core of the archaeological sites we look at. And so this is a map showing those plantation locations. The first is purchased, St. Inigo's is purchased in the 1630s, but purchases and donations go, well into the 19th century. And so those sites, they look for the most part like any other plantation does. There are churches on some of them. Many of the churches still stand, but not all of them. And so some of those sites are protected, again, like Dr. Beaupre said, because they're, right by churches. But some of them are federally owned land. So the excavations have happened because, let's say, the Navy wants to put in a utility corridor, and they say we need to make sure we're not going to destroy anything here. And so they go ahead and dig up, and that's where actually a lot of these artifacts have come from, a Navy base down here in St. Mary's County, Maryland. So those are some of the core sites that you find. And so you're not just learning about, missions to Indigenous people, you're looking at the system of enslavement of African Americans. And you're also looking at these sites that end up being really central to Catholic communities in Maryland. But we do see Indigenous sites, and this is an area that I've been trying to piece together these histories because the historical record is not great for understanding missions to Indigenous people, and the prevailing historical literature was there weren't any, right? It's when you piece these together, the fact that we have Jesuit residences. Here are different symbols looking for where the Jesuits are living around. All of the little symbols that you see here are native villages where Catholic artifacts have been found. And so when we're looking at these sites, we have to use a little bit of an analogy to what you might see in New France and say, oh, if we're finding a lot of these artifacts that look like they're coming from missions, perhaps they're related to these English missions. So I've been trying to piece this together for a number of years, trying to understand how we can identify mission sites, archaeological sites, often from collections that were excavated maybe 50 years ago, which is the case for a lot of these sites in Pennsylvania. And then finally, we'll see archaeological sites associated with African Americans who were particularly, you know, if they were perhaps enslaved by someone, but they maybe went to a church that was run by Jesuits, or you know, a church that was on a plantation. Like here, these are two quarter sites, so African American home sites in Prince George's County, Maryland, where you can see these Catholic artifacts. So there's a much greater variety and sort of a different type of site that you might expect to find in Maryland, in Greater Maryland. So we're going to finish up with Dr. Beaupre has some thoughts about how this ring came to be at the Alden House. And I'm sure we're open to other questions as well.
Thank you again. All right, so I hope that this does spur some conversation in the question period. So how did you guys get the ring at the Alden House? So yeah, hit the next slide, please. I know you have, oh, did I lose you? Okay, there we go. Awesome. If you advance the slide for me, please. There we go. Okay. I know you have the publication you put together about the archaeology, the Alden House area, and you have this quote from there that it was maybe associated with John Alden's dealings on the Kennebec River in Maine. And you're absolutely correct. That's one of the three possible explanations that I've kind of sussed out here. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. It is a possibility. The Cushnock settlement, or the Cushnock trading post, for those of you who don't know, was the Plymouth colony expanding a little bit into the fur trade and looking to recoup some cash that they lost. And so needing to get some economic inflow and trading with the Abenaki people here on the Kennebec River. Neat little fun fact. I'm actually sitting about a quarter mile. I said, thinking about it, I said a couple of 100 yards when we were talking earlier. I think it's more like a quarter mile from my desk right here. Just through this wall is the Kennebec River, and just up the little ways is where the Cushnock Trading Post archaeological site was. And they have it's actually owned by the city of Augusta currently. Great little museum there if you're ever in town to check it out. And so we know that there's a strong association between the Plymouth colony and Cushnock. So it's possible that the ring was picked up here in exchange with native peoples who are coming farther from the north. Those native people that would be bringing fur to the Cushnock Trading Post on the Kennebec, but may also be trading with the French on the St. Lawrence Valley or further up on the Chaudière or some of the other river valleys where there's more French settlement in that early 17th century period. Next slide. Another thought is, if you look at the map here, that Cushnock Trading Post should be right about where the B is in Eastern Abenaki. I don't know if you probably can't see my pointer, but there's the Norridge Walk Mission kind of in the center there of the slide. Thank you. And if you follow that, that's the Kennebec River. You follow it down to the coast, right about where the B is. A little further north is where the Cushnock site will be. I'm going to say that there's another possibility, that not from the Kennebec River Valley, but if we go one more river valley to the east, to the Penobscot River, you'll see that Pennagoet sign, and we're going to talk about that next as a possible source for this. Next slide, please. So we know that in the Penobscot River Valley, the French first started trading in an area called Castine in about 1611. So really predating that Plymouth arrival, was surpassed by the Plymouth colony in 1629 once the area was really kind of taken over by the Plymouth colony. But there was a Capuchin mission that took place in that same location when the French this is a time when the French and the English are vying for control of the coast of Maine, Maine being part of that Massachusetts Bay colony in someone's view. And so we know that there's a Capuchin mission there in 1654 rather. And so we know that there's an influx of Catholic material culture coming to the coast. Then, really neat little artifact here is actually a commemorative plaque that was set by the Capuchins in 1648, and was found by soldiers of the Union Army who were digging a fort nearby to protect the coast of Maine from Confederate incursion. Like the Confederates were going to get a navy up to Maine, but hey, you know, you had to keep the guys busy somehow. And they dug a fort called Fort Madison, an earthwork was right on the shore in Castine. And they recovered this plaque, which is actually now in the collection of the Maine Historical Society. So there's an option of, okay, the Capuchin Catholic missionaries we know are there, and early French trading is happening in that Penobscot River Valley, about that same time that Kushnock is occupied. Option number 3, the final slide and the one that I'm actually leaning towards, and I'm sure we can talk about this and we can unpack it, is that the ring showed up in your collection not by John Alden I, but by his son, Captain John Alden. Because there's an established relationship between John Alden the son and the Baron de Castine, the son of the original settler of the Fort Penegoet at Castine settlement. And we know through the historical documentation that these two individuals, the two sons, have a trading relationship that starts pre-1688, right? And then it's fascinating to see that these two individuals become proxies for the English and French government on the coast of Maine. And so we know in the summer of 1688 that St. Castin is actually supplying the local Abenaki people, again, acting as that kind of political agent, supplying them to fight against the English. In the fall of 1689, Governor Andros then sends Alden with supplies to St. Castin in an attempt to convert him to, or to stop him from inciting the Abenaki to attack the English, and to win over a single trader on the coast. By May 1690, there's another, Alden is sent as another envoy to bring tidings to Castine. He actually leaves before that expedition arrives in May of 1690. Castine is not there. He's taken flight for fear that he's going to be attacked again by the English. But these envoy relationships exist back and forth all the way up through. You end up with the final notion on this relationship comes in June 1700, which is right near the end of Captain John Alden's life, I believe, where he actually writes a letter to the governor of New York saying, hey, I've known this St. Castin guy for years. He really agrees that the French should be out of the coast and we should take over. And as long as you let him still do his commercial ventures on the coast, he'd be happy to be under the English crown. He doesn't care anywhere near as much. And so now that seems like an interesting personal relationship. We know that it's a strong tie between this trader that's coming out of the Boston area and one who's living on the coast of Maine who has access to this French material culture is French. But another kind of nail in the coffin, if you will, hit the next slide, that Castine's habitation has been excavated, at least partially, by archaeologists from the University of Maine, and they did find a number of Jesuit rings in the collection there. The first one that was recovered was noted as the first Jesuit ring that was actually found archaeologically in Maine, and there have been a number since, and also there's Castine's habitation as one site directly next to the actual fort. That was a military installation. It's just across the little gut there. So my gut feeling is that the ring came to the Alden family through John Alden, Captain John Alden Jr., and his relationship with Baron de Castine. But that's just a theory. I don't know. I wasn't there. And that's the fun part about archaeology, is the ability to look at these documents and the material culture together and make up stories that best fit the evidence. So with that, I will thank you all for your time and for listening. And I think we're happy to take questions.
So Christopher, do you want to go ahead and get us started?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm actually very excited that Andrew, you suggested the connection to Jean Vincent, the Baron de Saint Castine, because that was also my inclination when we first started discussing the ring at the Alden was, well, there was a personal relationship there. So that you've actually added a lot of detail coming from the site, the Pentagoet site in Maine, and some of the personal relationship between the two sons. That's pretty exciting. I also know we have a descendant, not of the Aldens, but of the Baron de Saint-Castine on the attendees, and I'm hoping they may pipe a question through. But let me start with something more in the realm of archaeology generally that came up. What happens if we know where something is buried? Who can we reach out to? Can we dig it up ourselves? And if we do, how do we make sure anything we find is respected by the archaeological authorities or by the authorities? So I think that's broadly to both of you.
Do you want to go first, Dr. Mazur, or?
You can go ahead. This is sort of your domain as the curator, right?
Okay, so that's a really good question. If you're in Maine, pick up the phone and call me. Actually, while I've been sitting here chatting with you all in the last hour, my phone in the other room has rang twice. I'm happy to chat with anybody who believes they've found an archaeological site. The danger with excavating it yourself. I love that you have the notion of there of, can I dig it up? And if it's on your own property, absolutely no one can stop you. We sometimes would rather that you not, right? Because like I was saying, the artifact is neat. The artifact is cool. But there's a green crayon on my desk, right? What does a green crayon mean without the information that, you know, my son was here coloring, and you can see the coloring and all of these other things that are telling a larger story about the people that lived there, right? The artifact itself, interesting, but the information. And we as archaeologists are trained to unpack that information. If you want to make sure that whatever you are excavating is going to be respected by the archaeological community, you got to let us know what's going on, and you got to let us get involved. Now, another important thing to remember, I can't speak for all states, but all of the states that I have worked in, and definitely the state of Maine, I will happily say right here, I have no power to take anything away from anybody who owns it. If you're excavating on private property that you own or land that you have permission to excavate on, I have no power to take items away or to take the land away or any of those things. The only caveat with that is that you're not allowed to dig up graves of anyone in Maine without a permit, whether they be Native Americans or Europeans. You can't dig up a grave without a permit, but that still is not, you know, our realm. So I would say call. If it's the state of Maine, call me. If it's anywhere else, Dr. Mazur, I mean, professors are always happy to get those phone calls as well.
Yeah, and honestly, depending on where you are, you know, you can reach out to us as a starting point, and we can always point you in the right direction. You know, I'm based out of Virginia. I work in Maryland. I work in DC, and I'm always happy to work with private landowners. And, you know, there's always people looking for projects, right? So we're always happy to partner with landowners, partner with people who are interested. And I know that I frequently, like pretty much every project I work on, I have local volunteers and you know, people who are not trained. And you don't need to be trained immediately, but you do need to work with a trained archaeologist if you want archaeologists to sort of respect what you're finding. And so we're, you know, most of us are trained in a way that we're happy to work with you and to have you part of the be part of the process of discovery and learning about objects.
Absolutely.
So the next question, I'm going to wrap two questions together that get to a similar thing. One of them comes from Father Tom McCoog, who is a historian and archivist among Jesuit priests. Are there items that would have come with regular or military settlers, not necessarily Jesuits? Why do we think that this particular ring has a Jesuit connection? And second, related question, and this came in off of the emails. Why Jesuits? Weren't Franciscans also part of missionary work in North America? Providence Island, for example, and Barbados had huge exchange with New England.
So I can get started. So, you know, what you know, you're going to look at get a different context depending on where you are geographically. So where I'm working in Maryland, there's not really other religious orders other than Jesuits. So per that second question, you know, yes, absolutely, you will see this kind of material culture associated with other religious orders. You might see, let's say you're looking at devotional medals, maybe 5 to 10% of them will have like a Jesuit associated with them. at, a Jesuit, a system of Jesuit missions, right? Most of them are more generalized. They might be saints that have devotions that are associated with a particular country of origin, like Spain or France. But for the most part, you see a sort of a general Catholic material culture. But absolutely, it can be associated with other religious orders. It's when you see those dead ringers, right? If you see Ignatius of Loyola, that's your Jesuit indicator. The other thing I would say is absolutely, you'll see these associated with any kind of person who can be Catholic, right? Who is going to practice or who has, in the case of indigenous groups, people who have appropriated the material culture and made a very different interpretation of it. So you can see these objects broadly. I like thinking about them as sort of understanding social networks of, they sort of start off as being traditional Catholic objects, and then they can become something different. But certainly you can see them at any number of sites. I know that I've seen the Brent site in Virginia. So sort of the first Virginian Catholics who are settling. There's devotional objects there. The Calverts, in their probate inventories, we know that they have devotional objects with them that they're bringing over as well. And I'll leave it to Dr. Beaupre if you have any especially military associated interpretations.
Yeah, sure. I think that there's that object of personal adornment issue as well. So you're absolutely correct. And like what Dr. Mazura said, devout Catholic individuals are going to carry these items with them. We talk about how artifacts get in the archaeological record. And one of those is through loss. People simply lost an object. And so, either it was something that they valued and it was part of who they were. We see in a lot of the religious medallions specifically where the attachment loop has actually been worn through from the string or the chain that it was on. And so that we indicate that the item had been lost. Now, we do have the benefit of trade lists a lot of times. And so what military units would order or what manifests would be brought with them. We don't see as many religious objects on those manifests, especially fur traders later in the 18th century. We do see some of those, we see rings mentioned or medallions, but those aren't necessarily have that same religious connotation as a lot of the objects we see. And just like Dr. Mazur said, in New France, when we're looking at it, the vast majority of priests that are here or missionary priests are Jesuits. They start with, there's some Franciscans, there's some Recollets, but when the real mission efforts start in earnest, we can identify sites that were only ever occupied by Jesuits, like Sainte Marie among the Hurons, or Sainte Marie de Ganantaha, or Sillery, or Saint Francois. There's a whole bunch of them that we know were only ever occupied by members of the Jesuit order. Once they start the Séminaire du Québec and they start training their own seminarians in Quebec that are a diocesan priest, and then we see those later in the 18th century spread out. Those things change a little bit, those dynamics change, but the vast majority of proselytization to native people in New France is being done by Jesuits. I think I hit all of those things.
You did. I've got several questions here. I'm going to try and pull together just two more questions that focus on some of your areas of scholarship. And then I would certainly encourage anybody else on the call to put through an email to us and we can follow up with some of those questions. But I want to kind of focus on your areas of scholarship. First of the remaining questions here. And there's a wonderful bit of intro on the Jesuit movement, into Asia and elsewhere. But ultimately the question comes to why might there have been family connections like those with Gabriel Archer in Virginia, such that Catholic objects would have still had a devotional relevance even to New England Protestants?
This is a great question, and it's one of the questions I puzzle over so often. Because you do find objects that are traditionally understood to be Catholic in contexts associated with Protestants. So that pipe clay statue. So it's the same clay that's used to make, tobacco pipes. Madonna and Child, House of a Huguenot, the reliquary from Gabriel Archer's coffin. The way that I tend to think about these objects is that when you see the period of the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation, it's not like people's beliefs and their understanding of their family heirlooms, it's just pop and it's going to change, right? It's a gradual change. And even if you see there's a sense like, oh, politically we need to convert, it doesn't mean that your understanding of your own faith is going to change radically. You might say, well, we're not going to use those rosary things because they're going to put us in jail if we use them. But maybe we have this statue that was my mother's, right? And it's a thing that you associate with a memory of a family member. So those personal relationships that Dr. Beaupre was talking about with rings. And I think you can see those also with the sort of the added layer of these relationships. And so I think it can be sort of maybe a theological holdover, but perhaps more in a deep-seated, like, personal level of what your faith is to you, and the fact that doesn't just radically change when you are told that it has changed, right? I think there's a lot of variability in the way that people express their faith, even within a religious tradition, even within one that's supposed to be really orthodox.
Very good. And then one more here, and I want us to kind of focus on New England because a lot of our folks are coming in from New England, and then I have a very fast question that came up on Maryland. But New England, Protestant missions are going on as well in New England. Certainly, we know the activity of Reverend John Eliot, the propagation of the Gospel Society. Where are Protestant missions going on in New England, and where are they coming up against the French activity in the region and the Jesuit activity in the region?
That is a great question because I apologize. I hope you can hear me. I had to switch to my headset. Our HVAC system to preserve the artifacts can be quite loud, so I apologize. I'm so glad somebody said this because I had wanted to work this into the presentation and I couldn't find a way to do it. So, as mentioned before, my work really focuses on this idea of the borderland. And so you have cultures clashing against each other, militarily, socially, religiously. And so, again, those Jesuit relations are a fascinating entrance into this world. And so back to our friend Father Ryle at the Norwich Walk Mission, right? He is protecting his flock, or the individuals he sees as his flock, as not only their parish priest, but as an agent of the French government as well. And there's a threat in that a Protestant missionary comes in and sets up shop at the base of the Kennebec River, so at the outlet where the Kennebec enters the ocean. And so down by what would be like Bath or Phippsburg, Maine now, right? And so this mission shows up, and his response, Father Ryle's response, is to write a letter, a very nicely worded letter that he sends down with an Indian courier, a Native American courier, to this Protestant missionary and says, hey, look, I see what you're doing. I know that you're trying to break into the trade here. You're trying to take, these devout Catholic individuals away from New France and from their proper faith. And it's not okay. And this is our territory. And you need to sally forth and leave. And so the account of this story, what's great about this is the account that we have is from a letter that Father Ryle has written to his nephew that ended up in the Jesuit relations. And so then he tells the rest of the story of that this Protestant missionary sent back a letter explaining that, he was wrong and that Catholicism wasn't the proper faith and that he had every right, this Protestant missionary had every right to be there. But Ryle not only attacks this theological difference, but he attacks the intelligence of the Protestant missionary and says, I got this letter and it took me 2 days to figure out what he was trying to say because his Latin was so terrible and how poorly educated this individual is that is trying to convert people. And, in that very religious way, being like, trying to take them over to the devil to make them Protestants right? And so he's telling the story to his nephew about how god awful the Latin was. And then he's like, I finally, after 2 days, figured out what he was trying to say. And there's all these holes in his argument. And so we think of these things as, New France, New England, separate areas. Well, these people are interacting constantly, whether they're at war, they're at peace, they're trading, they're battling. And like in the example with Keston and John Alden, literally fighting and trying to kill each other. And then 6 months later, trading and exchanging supplies and trying to be friends. And so there's a lot of like interaction along the borders between these people. And so you see Protestant missionaries. Anytime a Protestant missionary is moving into the hinterlands, bumping up against the Connecticut River Valley, going north into the Vermont, New Hampshire border, we see them in Bennington, going into the Green Mountains and bushing up against the Catholic missionaries that are coming out of St. Frederick on Lake Champlain, right? And so you see these interactions taking place, and it's fascinating to see that these individuals recognize each other as both men of God and recognize that there is a play there, but they have fundamental disagreements in government and in religion, and they kind of go at each other about it. Fascinating.
Really great, guys. I want to thank you on behalf of my Jesuit institution and the Jesuits in the Eastern United States for your continuing scholarship. I also want to ask any of those on our call, any of those looking at the recording later, please feel encouraged. It's a free will offering, but support the Alden Kindred of America. A $5 donation at the alden.org website is going to support more programs like this and excellent opportunities for all of you to get some of the great scholarship here. I want to turn this over now to Desiree back at the Alden House in Duxbury, who wants to say a bit more about something special that the Alden Kindred has prepared recently.
Thank you so much, Christopher, and thank you, Andrew and Laura, for that really fascinating presentation. I just wanted to remind you all that I have been recording this program, and we will be posting it on the Alden website. As Christopher mentioned, we do have a special treasure that we are debuting this year, and that is a reproduction copy of that Jesuit trade charm that we have created. So you can see it at the Alden website under the shop. Encourage you to come visit us. We are opening to the public tomorrow for the season with guided tours and the chance to explore the Alden archaeology exhibit that also includes this ring and many other fascinating treasures. Again, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for this wonderful program. And for any other information about Alden House, please visit, again, alden.org. Thank you.